Questions is a space to explore big topics about life, its meaning, and also what Christianity has to say about them. Today we'll be looking at the world's best-selling book, and is it irrelevant? I'm delighted to say we've got Amy Orr Ewing, the director of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, coming to speak on this topic today. She'll give a short talk followed by discussion around your tables, and then a time for Q&A as well. So do be thinking about questions throughout the talk and text them to the number that's just on this lectern and around the room as well. But without further ado, I'll invite her up.
Thank you for that welcome. It's great to be here. I was just texting my husband. We were at the other place at Oxford saying, I've just arrived in Tabland, so it's great to be here with you all sample the delights of your beautiful city. So I've been asked to speak for a few moments on this question of the world's best-selling book, whether it's irrelevant today. And thought I'd begin by quoting a friend of mine, a colleague now at the OCCA. He became a Christian while studying philosophy at university, and he commented that it struck him that one person in 60 billion who stands out deserved a second look. Of course, he was referring to Jesus. And today, as we think about the book that contains the eyewitness accounts of Jesus, his life and death, we're going to notice a few things about it. It's arguably the most successful literary creation ever produced, even just on literary terms. It's been extraordinarily internationally influential. You could look at Homer's Iliad, that's been translated into 40 languages, Shakespeare into 60, and the Bible into well over 2,000 languages. That's more than 10 times any other book. And the Bible is every publisher's dream, really. It's the world's bestseller, still selling 44 million copies every year. And some of the phrases recorded in the Bible have become proverbial in the English language, often used today without any remembrance from whence they came. Phrases like the salt of the earth, love thy neighbour, do unto others, the good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the blind leading the blind, judge not lest you be judged. The one who lives by the sword dies by the sword, wolves in sheep's clothing, cast the first stone, eat, drink and be merry, the sign of the times, go the extra mile, and so on. So our language is punctuated, is filled with these phrases originating from the Bible. So this book has certainly had a massive impact, but is it still relevant today? Well, I want to just spend a couple of minutes, first of all, thinking about what the Bible is made of and whether it's a sort of substantially reliable text, and then come on to think for a few moments about whether it's relevant. So when we look at the Bible, it's not just one book. It's a collection of 66 books divided into two sections, as I'm sure you're aware, 39 books in the first part of the Old Testament, 27 in the New. And it's written over a period of 1,600 years by more than 40 authors. So often people kind of imagine that this is some sort of culturally homogenous book, or it's really containing one person's voice or perspective. But that isn't at all the case. The people who contributed to this were from different backgrounds. You have kings and diplomats writing, but you also have really poor people, the perspective of someone at the lowest end of society. The prophet Amos would be a good example of that. He was the dresser of sycamore fig trees, the dirtiest job in his culture. The Bible is written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and it's written on 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. So the vast spread of the Bible's original social, geographical, and cultural contexts is then followed on by a multiplication of diversity as when the New Testament in particular was written, it was immediately translated into multiple different languages, copied and spread throughout the known world. So that means that when we're talking about the text, there's actually a vast number of sources to be examined. When we think about the material used, just briefly, I think it's helpful to visualise that. The most common writing material at the time was papyrus. That's a sort of highly durable reed from the Nile Valley that was laid out in the sun to dry, glued together, a bit like plywood is today, and then written on. The other material was parchment. It was much more expensive, made from the skin of sheep or goats, and really reserved for documents that were considered to be valuable and especially important. So when we look at the Bible, and what you see is both manuscripts that are papyrus and parchment. You see multiple versional witnesses, not just in the Greek language, but in all of these other translations that were floating around. So when you think about an ancient document, there are a few things that are important to consider in terms of sort of assessing its viability and reliability. The first might be the time distance between when the original was written and when the earliest surviving witnesses to it were written. So, for example, we might look at early copies of Plato, and we'd see that there were 10 existing copies of ancient manuscripts that are available for us to study and compare, to think about whether they're accurate, look at the transmission of his writings. And the oldest of those would date from 1,300 years after Plato wrote, and that would be considered to be really quite good. Or we could look at Homer's Iliad. We'd be looking about 643, and the earliest is 500 years after Homer wrote. So when we look at the New Testament, there are thousands of handwritten manuscripts in the Greek language in support of the New Testament. Thousands, and actually that number changes constantly, month to month. It's hard to keep track of. And many of the earliest copies are separated from the originals not by 1,300 years, but by decades. So the earliest fragment of John's Gospel, the John Rylands Papyrus, is here in Britain. You can go and look at it, and it's from about 110 AD. So not that hundreds of years, but just by decades. So the textual attestation of the New Testament is really unparalleled with ancient writing. This hasn't been done in a sort of slapdash way, but with care and attention. And so as you look at what the Bible is and consider whether it's relevant today, when you study the original sources, what you see is that it's an extremely well attested text. But that still leaves us with the question of whether it's really relevant. Does the Bible speak to our most fundamental questions, like our universal search for meaning as human beings, like the questions that all of us will grapple with about evil and violence and suffering in the world around us, like the question of what is it that is going to actually satisfy that ache inside every human being. Now, it's not only the Bible, of course, that claims to be able to address such questions, and you may want to lay alongside the Bible's attempts at answers to such questions alongside alternatives. Of course, we're always being sold multiple routes and paths to happiness and fulfillment and meaning as human beings. I've noticed in going into bookshops in Oxford that a lot of the sort of most current suggestions about how to be happy seem to be Scandinavian. This time last year, Vogue ran a piece entitled "Forget Hygge, 2017 will be all about lagom." The article went on, "Has the concept of hygge entered your consciousness? You're not alone. Hygge, or the Danish idea of coziness, can be found in anything from a roaring fire to a perfect pair of lumpy socks, and it's long been a vital part of Scandinavian culture. 2016 was the year that Hygge moved global. But lagom, the Swedish concept of not too much, not too little, is going to dominate 2017. Then in September 2017, so as 2017 is drawing to an end, The Independent ran an article asking the question, is Ikigai the new Hygge? The Japanese concept of finding purpose in our lives. And it goes on, you've tried Hygge and lagom, but it turns out that actually it's Ikigai that is the key to happiness. We've snuggled up in knitted sweater, filled our rooms with wood-scented candles in the pursuit of Hygge, that Danish concept of finding contentment in coziness. But when that didn't work out, we turned to lagom, the Swedish idea of moderate living. But it turns out we're still not happy. So maybe it's Ikigai, the lifestyle concept from Japan, that will help us live our lives. In some ways, Ikigai is the antithesis of Hygge. Instead of encouraging us to slow down, it's all about striving to find purpose in life. What's going to make you happy? What is it that is going to satisfy that ache in every human being? Is it cashmere slippers? Is it moderation? Or is it a whip-cracking spreadsheet outlook on life? Or perhaps it's wealth. Acquire money. Become more materialistic, be successful, and that is how you can be happy. Oliver James, in his book Affluenza, though, has noticed that when human beings centre our lives on money, possessions, and personal appearance, we begin to suffer from increased levels of depression, anxiety, and relationship breakdown. In his studies, he found that the more materialistic we are, the less loyal, helpful, and joyful we become. He describes affluenza as a virus-like condition that spreads through affluent countries. In these countries, notably English-speaking ones, people define themselves by how much money they make. He quotes the sociologist Erich Fromm, who said, "We've moved from a state of being to a state of having." He explores Vance Packard's famous book on advertising, The Hidden Persuaders, looking at the job of advertisers to create false needs, saying our whole society is being geared around this creation of false needs, making us want more stuff. Packard wrote in the 1950s, and what Oliver James notices is that the fallout of 60 years of the creation of false needs gets worse with each successive generation, as each generation becomes more anxious and more depressed. The more we seek affluence, the less happy we seem to become. Well, amidst this myriad of options, Jesus Christ in John's Gospel, whose first recorded words in that Gospel are the question, what do you want? Goes on to claim to be able to satisfy the longing of every human heart. John, in his Gospel, records Jesus Christ making this staggering statement. He says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Is the Bible relevant today? Well, it certainly identifies this key question of human emptiness, our search for meaning. And it certainly claims to be able to contain the answer to that ultimate question in the person of Jesus Christ. Could it be that this poor son of an unmarried first-century mother who lived under an occupier in a tiny, insignificant country in the Middle East in that first century, could it be that he has the answer to life's deepest question? If so, the Bible would be far from irrelevant. The Bible positions itself as containing these extraordinary, vast truth claims about this person, Jesus Christ. Now, questions of truth can be extremely disconcerting. In December 2017, the Independent newspaper reported on a particular phenomenon of post-truth. And here's how the article began. The Shed at Dulwich was London's top-rated restaurant. Just one problem: it didn't exist. The article goes on. The writer Ubar Butler used his home, a shed in Dulwich, a garden shed in Dulwich, a website and a burner phone to create the concept restaurant, and he got it verified on TripAdvisor. He created a web page with menus inspired by moods, and he said he was aiming at a concept silly enough to infuriate your dad. He wrote and he illustrated it with photographs of artsy-looking dishes of food, but they weren't made out of food. They were made out of household products like laundry tablets and shaving cream. Within weeks, the fake restaurant had climbed the rankings on TripAdvisor as Butler and his friends wrote fake reviews, and then other people began to write reviews. After the restaurant was ranked 30th on TripAdvisor, restaurant inquiries started coming in from around the world, including Hollywood superstars, Saudi royal family, people trying to get a table at this restaurant. Some even tried to find the restaurant in the real world and were wandering up and down his street in Dulwich, asking neighbours, "Do you know how to get into the Shed at Dulwich?" Butler wrote, the more the phone rings, the more this thing just takes off. And then he received a note from TripAdvisor, and he was expecting to hear that he'd been exposed. But instead, the company told him he'd received 89,000 views in a single day, and the Shed at Dulwich had ascended to the #1 restaurant ranking in London. The only problem being, it didn't exist. Questions of truth can be uncomfortable. When we think about truth in the abstract, it seems less important to be certain. You know, the issue doesn't particularly concern us personally. Is it true that ex-government minister briefed against the Prime Minister or not? It may or not be true, I don't particularly care. But in other realms, questions of truth are more highly charged. Is it true that your girlfriend cheated on you last night? Is it true that the person you thought was your father is actually your father? Those aren't matters to be just sort of shrugged off with a kind of, well, everyone's perspective is equally true. Jesus Christ, who in the Bible, recorded for us by John's Gospel, said, "I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Jesus, who claimed to answer the deepest question of the human heart, our search for meaning, our ache for purpose and longing for happiness, also said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He's locating truth as an essential question. It really does matter whether his claims hold water. Now, of course, some choices are just a matter of preference. Do you prefer chocolate or vanilla? I've got 3 children, and they all have different preferences with food. So some choices just are a matter of preference. Others are a matter of fact. You're up the mountain, and you're asking the question, will the rope hold? I suggest to you today that this question about the Bible's relevance and the trustworthiness of the claims it contains about Jesus Christ is of that second order. Will the rope hold? At the beginning of John's Gospel, he introduces us to this idea of the Logos, saying that God is the Word, or the Logos, who is there at the beginning. That Greek word logos is the one from which obviously we derive the word logic, but it already had a meaning in the Greco-Roman world. Stoics understood it as the rational principle behind the universe. Thought, reason, science itself are encapsulated in that concept. Logos was also understood as a kind of expression of speech. But here in his gospel, John takes this word, which people already understood to a certain extent, and he applies it to Jesus Christ. saying this person who lived in history at a particular moment in a specific geographical location, written about by historical eyewitnesses, that person is the source of creation and information. John says that it's through the Logos that all things were made and that Logos went on to become flesh and dwell among us. That God, the creator of the world, the uncaused first cause of the universe, the Logos from whom all information derives, entered the world as a human being. The author, as it were, entering his own story. If that is true, it would be extremely relevant. H.G. Wells called Jesus the most dominant person in human history. Jesus is claiming to be the foundation of truth and reality, and claiming to be able to meet the deepest need of every human being, to give us that bread of life, eternal life, actual life. John, in his gospel, if we'll read it, is asking us to believe that in Jesus, new life and actual ontological, substantial change happens for any human being who comes to Jesus Christ, receiving his love, forgiveness, and new life. Christian faith is not primarily an intellectual position about ideas, although it encourages people's scrutiny and questions and does have robust answers. If true, though, Christian faith at its heart is the offer of a relationship with a personal and real God who entered history in Jesus. And the promise that coming to know him, meeting him, receiving his forgiveness is like eating life. That coming to know him means that you are no longer hungry in that most ultimate sense anymore. Listen to the verdict of one of Britain's leading atheists, Matthew Paris. One of my favourite writers, writes in the Times a lot and the Spectator. This is what he wrote based on his observations of meeting Christians as an adult in the country where he originally grew up, that he'd gone back to visit. He says, now I'm a confirmed atheist. He came to this university, by the way, and he sort of flirted with Christianity, but he's an atheist. He says, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes, sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts. These alone will not do, he writes. Education and training alone will not do. Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. That's Matthew Paris's verdict. The critical question is this: is it true? See, it may sound nice and even good that there's a God who exists, who brought the universe into existence. There's a rationality behind the universe, and that God is loving, or even that he's entered history. We can know things about him, we can sing about him or think about him. But is it actually true? Is there substance to Jesus' claims recorded for us in the Bible? Or is it ultimately just a bit like the latest Scandinavian scam or lifestyle system? Well, the whole thing hangs on Jesus' death on the cross, recorded for us in 4 historical accounts and included in the Bible. Christians wear crosses and remember the death of Jesus, not as the unfortunate or sad death of a good person, but as the sacrificial death of the Son of God that actually happened once and for all in human history, recorded in the Bible. Jesus Christ died not a sort of lovely, nice, good man, and we sort of think, oh, how sad, it was rather unfair. the heart of the claim is that he died in our place, offering his life instead of ours, offering us that bread of life, that eternal life. And for anyone who's willing to put their trust in him, turn away from making their own way, acknowledging their need for forgiveness and that new life that he offers, that promise is real for today. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. To receive that life, the forgiveness and love of God, in reality meant God coming in history in Jesus. And the Bible gives us real access to him so that we can explore that, so that we can think about it, so that we consider it, and so that we can perhaps personally respond. And I want to suggest to you today that nothing could be more relevant to us as human beings than that. Thank you for listening.
Okay, well, we're going to come to a time of questions now. So first of all, if anyone's got a question from the floor, we can bring a mic to you. Just stick your hand up. Otherwise, we'll go to those texted in. Yes, just wait for the microphone.
Hi, so you spent quite a lot of your talk saying that if the claims of Jesus are true, it would be very important and relevant, and if this bit is true, and if it's accurate. You didn't really explain why it is accurate, or any more accurate than any other religious text or comparable self-help book.
Sure, okay. Thank you for that question. Obviously, we have 20 minutes, and usually I do the sort of talk much more kind of laying out detailed explanations of that kind of thing. So apologies if that's what you were hoping for more of. I think that I would probably give kind of two prongs of answers as to why I think a very, very strong case can be made for this being true, and specifically Jesus' statements. One would be along the kind of textual lines, and we talked a little bit about manuscripts, but I think much more significantly evidence from both within the text and outside of the text that the four Gospels in particular are eyewitness statements, and based on eyewitness statements. A study was done in the year 2000 by some sort of random researchers on the use of popular, this is just one example, of the use of popular names in the first century. And it was a comprehensive list of name occurrence within archaeology, inscriptions, like every instance of a name occurrence in all the evidence that they could find in the first century of male and female names, so lists made of both. And the study focused on Greco-Roman Egypt and Greco-Roman Judea, Palestine, and focused on different communities, but one of the communities was the Jewish community. And what's fascinating is that what the research showed is that both male and female names, according to all the evidence outside the Bible in Greco-Roman Judea, shows the same level of occurrence. So it's 40% of name usage outside of the Bible and 41% of name usage inside of the Bible, looking at the four Gospels and the book of Acts, which are specifically located there. And then comparing that, for example, with name usage in Greco-Roman Egypt of the Jewish community, so 20, 30 miles away, but a community of the same kind of ethnic group and religious group, and the top 10 names, there's only 2 names that are the same of name occurrence. So a sort of statistical analysis of the text, asking the question, is this genuinely of of the place and of the time. Now, the gospel writers were not all writing in Judea. Out of the 4, only Matthew was writing in Judea. The other 3 were writing in other locations, which could lead one to conclude, well, it's not sort of rigorously historically accurate what's being written. There's a great deal of distance between the people, both culturally and geographically, and in terms of time, years, between what they're writing and what's included. So looking at evidence from outside the text and rigorously asking, is what is recorded incidentally, so details of places, names, distances, the economic system, the shape of houses, the botany of the place, the popular names that are used, the kind of incidental details of culture, are those things accurate? And what's astonishing when you look at the Bible, when you look at the 4 Gospels in particular, is that the answer to that is yes. And it's ostensibly yes, that's verifiably the case. And then I think the second thing I'd say is that when we look at the New Testament, there are very culturally inconvenient things that this whole thing hangs on, which people had every predisposition not to include. And I'll just use the example of the role of women in the narrative, for example. So obviously, culturally, a woman's opinion, word, presence in any decision-making was, frowned upon. There's an incident of Jesus meeting a woman in John's Gospel, chapter 4, and the disciples come back and see him having a conversation, just one-on-one with a woman. And the text says they were astonished, staggered, that Jesus would even speak personally to a woman. Yet in the text, the 3 most important things about Jesus' claims to be God and substantially what he's accomplished hang on primarily the word of women. Think about it. The first would be the claim that Jesus is God incarnate, that he's not just a normal human being, that he is actually God with us. The primary witness to that idea of incarnation is Mary, a teenage woman, unmarried, pregnant teenager. The second most important thing about Jesus is that he died on the cross. Who are the witnesses to his crucifixion? All 4 gospel accounts position women as the primary witnesses to the details of the crucifixion. All 4 gospel accounts agree that the male disciples deserted Jesus. In one account, John is there, but he's standing at a distance. So the Bible tells us that the incarnation is primarily witnessed by a woman. The crucifixion is primarily witnessed by women. And then the resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb, the first people there are women. The whole thing hangs on the word of women. Now, that's actually really good evidence that wasn't made up, because you would never ever have made that up. So those would be kind of two examples I might give. But sorry, it's a very long answer. But thank you, a great question.
And finally, off the back of that, even if the Bible, if the text is true and reliable, why does it have to be something for me? Why is it relevant for me? And yeah, what if I'm content without Jesus? Why can't I live without what he says?
Great, thank you. Again, a really good question, a really honest question. Thank you for that. I think I would want to leave you with 2 challenges, if that's okay. If that's you, if you're thinking, well, even if it's true, even if it is reliable, I'm not really that interested. I'm happy as I am. My first challenge would be, is it really true when you look into your own heart, when you look into your own life, even at your young age? I feel incredibly old standing here today. But even as you reflect on the relationships you have, on the way that you treat those around you, the standards that you hold people to, the question of whether you live up to those standards. Is that really enough? Are you honestly saying that that's good enough? And my challenge to you would be that the major difference between a Christian and someone who isn't a Christian is that a Christian recognises their need for intervention from outside, for help, for forgiveness, for guidance, for what we would call salvation, which is about after death, but it's also about today. So that would be my first challenge. And then the second challenge would be about not just today, but into eternity as well. You see, Jesus speaks about eternal life in the present tense, but what he speaks about as life is beyond material life. That is experienced in the material world, but also experienced after we die as well. And so it's extremely important whether what he has to say about after material life is true or not, because if it is true, his offer to be with him in eternity, his offer to pay for our sin and give us forgiveness isn't just an experience of liberation in the present, it's also a promise of hope and life into eternity beyond the grave. And I suggest to you that does two things. It changes the way you live today. It changes the freedom that you experience today, but of course it has an impact beyond the grave, and it's enormously important. Listen, if what Jesus says isn't true, then it doesn't matter. But if it is true, it really, really does.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks.
Thank you. If some of the words that Jesus said that Amy quoted in her talk intrigued you, or you want to find out more that he has to say, these books are on your table. They're John's Gospel, an account of Jesus' life. So do take them with you. They're free to take away and read them for yourself and see what the Bible actually has to say. Also, if you're unsure about the reliability of the Bible, Amy's written a book herself called Why Trust the Bible, and that explores more of the historical and other evidences for the Bible being true, which she touched on a bit, but if you want to explore them more, these books will be on the table on the way out. Also, next week, we've got a talk. Mark Mennel is coming to join us to speak on what makes us human, a question of identity, what makes me, me. So do come along to that. That's next week. But apart from that, stay around if you can. Chat more on your tables as desserts are brought out, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.